Okay, welcome to our 12th webinar of the series 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, this is Hendrik Tieben from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and with my co-host Luisa Bravo, founder of the Journal of Public Space, we invited for you a range of distinguished speakers from different parts of the world. As the virus continues to spread, and we experience here, for example, in Hong Kong, our third wave of the pandemic, we want to discuss with you ideas for future safe and sustainable urbanization. If you want to get in touch with us during the webinar, please send us your questions via the Q&A function. My colleagues Ying and Chen and Stephanie Cheung will select some questions for a roundtable discussion at the end of the session. And you can also get in contact with us after the session via email if you want to propose a topic for a future webinar, or also if you want to be a panelist in one of the sessions. If you have missed one of the earlier sessions, you can watch the videos of all webinars on our YouTube channel. And that's all from my side. And I want to pass now to Luisa Bravo, who will introduce today's panelists and the theme.
Thank you, Hendrik, and welcome to the speakers and to the attendees for today's webinar. We are glad to have speakers from United Kingdom, United States, United Arab Emirates and Tanzania to discuss about this very challenging topic, which is future safe and sustainable urbanization. Well, now we are aware that we have to rethink how to safely live in cities. So it's not just about sustainable development, but it's also about safety and to manage this health emergency that apparently, according to what we are seeing these days, will continue. I see from Italy, where I'm currently based, that we are actually putting in place some measurements at the political and level to manage the current situation and to manage future conditions of health emergency. And many are saying that we will be probably hit again in October by a second wave. So we must be prepared, and regarding development, we have to be prepared in terms of safety, because we care about lives, and we need to care about conditions of people living in cities. So I think we can start by giving the floor to the speakers. We will have the first round of presentations from all the speakers, and then later we will try to develop further the topic of this webinar and to try to answer to some questions. We are happy to answer to questions from the audience. So in case you want to ask questions to our speakers, use the Q&A button to be in touch with us so that we are taking into account your questions while speakers are presenting. As I said, we have a very nice panel of speakers today. The first one is Charles Wolfe, who's based in the United Kingdom and is a London-based urbanist and writer, currently guest a scholar at the Center for the Future of Place at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. But Chuck has a very long experience both as an academic and as a professional. He's a lawyer. And he traveled a lot and he published several books. The last one that actually I have a copy of, Seeing the Better Cities, thanks to the generosity of Chuck that actually signed and gave me a copy when we met 2 years ago in Australia. while he was developing a research period as a Fulbright specialist. So I'm happy to have Chuck today with us from United Kingdom. Chuck, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luisa, and Hendrik. It's good to see you again as well. It's been a year and a half for Hendrik, and it's been about a year for Luisa. So I'm going to start with what is I'm going to share my screen here with what is perhaps a understandably global and broad presentation based on someone who was a practicing lawyer in Seattle, who traveled a lot, as Luisa said, and then is on his way to being something else, and I'm not quite sure what that is yet. But the kind invitation caught me at a time where we're about to have a third book out based on work that I have been doing in Stockholm, as well as an article I have in preparation about something that I think speaks to the topic today, which I call place healing. And I'm going to use both my prior work and this place healing idea as a shell, if you will, for where we are today. And I'm there we go. So as you all know, we're all living this adventure at different speeds, to different degrees of government diligence and perhaps failures. If you'd talked to me a year ago, Greg will appreciate this. You'll hear all about Seattle from him. But a year ago, I wrote an article for one of the Seattle publications, Crosscut, about congestion pricing and what that might mean for Seattle, because some of my former colleagues there were kind enough to say, well, Chuck's in London and Stockholm, maybe he can help us out. So this was maybe one aspect of the safe city that people were talking about a year ago. And by safe, I mean climate change and broader issues that we are all dealing with on a global basis. And then, of course, the world changed. And it was bad enough when we were dealing with just the pandemic. But because I'm a broad thinker, I can't separate that, nor can many of you, from the distinct issues of environmental justice and equity, Black Lives Matter, and more that has crept into our reality based on some frustrations related to the pandemic and some long-needed social airing that we have. And so when I look at the future and a safe place going forward, a safe and sustainable place, I include more than the physical environment, although ironically, as a former lawyer, I'm very visual. But I want to offer, and I don't have time to talk about it today, it'll be out later in the summer, both in English and Portuguese, a whole idea of place healing, which takes on a number of boxes here, which I will talk about very quickly at the end. We cannot, of course, talk about all of this. But when the pandemic came along, we were working on this book called Sustaining a City's Culture and Character, Principles and Best Practices. It's a bit delayed by my new publisher, Roman and Littlefield, being on furlough, quite honestly, for a while. But independent of the pandemic, I penned these words: imagine if the city around you disappeared and everything familiar in your daily life and routine suddenly ceased to exist. How would you reinvent your city? I promise you, I wrote that before the pandemic. And I'm a little bit frustrated the book's not out yet, because I think it does speak in a general way to some of these ideas. So what has been to happen in the United Kingdom, where I've been headquartered for almost 3 years now? And I'm going to give you a visual tour and leave you with some thoughts. Well, where I live in Greater London, in the borough of Richmond upon Thames, where Kew Gardens is, and the Great Richmond Park, as some of you may know. These are the visions we've started to see and we are living with now. I think always with this type of intervention that we are all very aware of, an accelerated, bikeable, walkable city based on the pandemic, with these types of interventions, we have to wonder, will they stick? And this gets to the book, can you impose a pattern? and I just wrote a little piece on this, the passeggiata of Luisa, can you impose that upon the Twickenham town within Richmond upon Thames? Well, looks like it, doesn't it? And I think in order for these things to stick as the pandemic evolves, I would propose not only do we need place healing, but we need a unity between culture, character, not in a precious or heritage way, but we need to have a reality that local people can understand using their own language. So this is the oldest street in Twickenham. As you can tell, it's a medieval curving street that says road closed, and now it's pedestrian. We're seeing a lot of that in the UK to keep people, ironically, off public transit at the densities that were previously the case, and to encourage al fresco dining, biking, and walking. As Kew Gardens reopened, there was the temporary measures where we see the simple things which fall into a new use. And part of place healing is adaptation. And I really, some of you know from my earlier writing, Luisa was kind enough to reference it, I really like to look at these simple solutions. Some would call this tactical urbanism, some would call this pop-up, but this shows about the second day after Kew Gardens, the Royal Botanical Gardens opened on an appointment-only basis. And what do we see? We see simple things that we all have in our homes, a card table or, you know, and simple signage to regulate entry. This speaks to safety in its early period. What else do we see in these adaptations, these healing adaptations? We see an old icon, and are these, you know, the phone booths aren't used anymore really in their classic form, but they are there for the tourists, and they are there as some sort of historic continuity perhaps, but we see it right next to a COVID-19 advisory one-way pedestrian system across the Richmond Bridge. And this is a one-way with arrows, and guess what? Half the people ignore it, the arrows. This is another issue of our time. How do we infuse a sense of responsibility on everyone? I want to begin to end with a simple story about another way of creating a safe city. And this is going to be in the book, and I wrote another small piece about it. Bobtail Fruit is a fruit vendor that was once in the old Covent Garden before it gentrified, the old fruit market of Greater London. And apparently the owner had a bobtail hairstyle, so they called it Bobtail Fruit. Well, that evolved over time as times changed to fruit stands at tube stations, at subway stations, which is really, even before the pandemic, no longer sustainable. Take a look at this photo, which is obviously a delivery. They're headquartered in a rail arch now, and they deal with a warehouse. And the point is that they have survived the pandemic and furthered their business by becoming a delivery service, their own little Amazon. And they already were in that business, delivering to offices and delivering high-end fruit and, you know, milk and so on for the daily office grind. Well, as that has pulled away with the pandemic, they've gone residential, they've expanded the number of postcodes where they deliver and so on and so forth. So this is another form of healing that doesn't have necessarily a physical manifestation, but we have to think about in the mix and match going forward. So finally, from history, we see another, you know, argue this is place healing over time. This is in the borough of Hounslow next door in the old village of Isleworth. And it shows the different eras evolving. And again, I want to stress, because some people think, old white guy here, I'm presenting this from a precious heritage perspective, but I'm not. I'm, you know, trying to show how things evolve with human beings. Here we have, as you can see, a range of development, but the core village and even the old church from the 12th century with a somewhat ungodly new, improvement, and all the cars and so on and so forth. But guess what? There is a plague pit in the back of the church in the cemetery, and here was a mass burial of 149 people from the famous 1664-65 plague in London. We've been through this before. There can be lessons learned, and I like to stress this continuity in these tactical times because we still can learn great deals from history. So here's the chart again. We don't have time, in deference to the other speakers, to go into this. I think I'll provide a copy of the PowerPoint for you all to study, but this shows the type of thing that we can look at in a more holistic approach to a safer future. If you want to read more about this, it's a plug for the books and the new one that's coming at the end of the year. And that is my presentation. So thank you very much, and I will unshare myself.
Thank you, Chuck, for this manifesto, which would be interesting to know more, and hopefully we will have more time during the roundtable discussion to explain more and discuss with other speakers.
Sure.
Now I would like to invite Dania Rajagopal. Sorry if my pronunciation is wrong. She's based in New York, and she recently worked as a program associate at Design Trust for Public Space. Previously she was a research intern involved in at the Gell Institute, involved in updating the public life toolkit. She also has a master in urban placemaking and management from the Pratt Institute. Thank you for joining, and Dania, now you have the floor. We cannot hear you. You have to unmute.
Yeah, now?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. The learning curve is really steep with these things. All right, so I'm still, thinking about what the previous speaker just spoke about, place healing, and that's going to be a conversation that we have to keep thinking about, not forgetting the lessons of the past. And I know I keep thinking I'm 1/10 of the experts that all of you are, but I do believe that there are some things that I've been working on that I want to share, and hopefully can continue that work after the pandemic as well. So the future safe aspect of urbanization largely deals for me with these three things, which is the aspect of social networks, the aspect of seeing critical infrastructures through physical spaces, and also emergency preparedness. And it's weird because for decades, urban planners in India have been saying we need wide sidewalks, and almost always it's considered that it's like an aesthetic thing. But more now than ever, sidewalks have become like the emergency place to go, or the roads have become adapted for emergency preparedness. So a thought kept arising, why not redefine public spaces from the funding perspective, from the health perspective, as a critical infrastructure. So a little about what I do with Design Trust is because the model that they adopted really looks at long-term policy implementations through short-term pilots and testing, and that happens in phases. So they work in collaboration with governments, project partners, community groups, and advisory committees. So each project, project will have a specific set of fellows and goals who work in tandem. So that way you have new MOUs signed, which never happened before, or new ways of looking at public space design or resiliency as a whole. So that way groups that didn't before have the time to sit together and decide, get to do that. A good example of this is the L space that we did. I mean, obviously it started way before I joined, but it's interesting because it happened in phases, and right now the Department of Transportation has adopted this as a policy. And it really started by looking at how infrastructure such as the flyover can become, for example, a drain pipe that filters into a planter box, you know, like the runoff from the flyover is most often wasted. And how can these spaces also become more inviting and fill in the lack of space in New York City? And we also did something in called Future Culture in Staten Island, wherein we asked the cultural community, which is a term coined for this project, which meant people who lived, worked, and you know, like contributed to the community, because communities itself has many definitions. So cultural community sort of helped talk about the past, present, and the future of the North Shore, and the ways in which prior projects have worked and who worked with them. So it became like a continuous collection of these points on a map, like the ones that you see on this. So when I think about all my experience here, and I think about my work in Chennai, or my responsibility as an Indian to contribute to some of the work in Chennai, I always think of the pain points that are currently present. Chennai is really populated right now, and according to the urban design guidelines that the country follows, even the minimum requirement of open space per person is not met. And like, if you compare this with 1.81 square meter with New York or London, you can see how big the difference is. And of course, our largest public space is the beach in itself. So it's very important that right to access and the urban commons is especially, you know, like managed well. So when I think about future space, you cannot think about it without these aspects of water, safety, accessibility, and urban commons, and more importantly now health. Another way by which governments are trying to strengthen their capacities is through the aspect of local self-governance and strengthening the urban local bodies, which have played a huge role in the crisis, because they are able to reach inner neighborhoods which the state and central government cannot reach in terms of aids and resources. But it's become more and more clear that the capacity training or the decentralized nature of these institutions have sort of handicapped these institutions from doing their best. And one of the ongoing discussions in this side of the world is, how do we strengthen these local institutions and make them more decentralized? And by building this place coalition, it's possible to build, you know, like connectivities within groups that would have otherwise not, you know, like shared their resources. And this has been seen in like the digital divide that's in the US, how some people are able to work from home and some students are not able to. So the University of Tennessee, you know, like coordinated with the city's public utility company, and they helped create drive-up Wi-Fi sites. And concept of shared use agreements is another one that has been adopted in many places, where a space can be shared after hours, or a gym or a library can be shared by the community after these schools shut down. And these provide safe spaces in India, particularly because there's a lack of public spaces, yes, but there's also concerns with safety, which in turn affects workforce participation, which in turn reduces the contributions that women can have in the society. So before even building, you know, pretty beautified places, the city really does not have much to provide in terms of funding when it comes to these very basic policy and infrastructural change. And recently in 2019, it was a shock when I was here in New York and Chennai had announced day zero. And it's a man-made disaster. Like, we managed the lands that were supposed to be wetlands in a way that caused floods and droughts at the same time. And rivers were polluted by industries that, despite having laws prohibiting it, continue to do it. So fishing communities have been at the forefront of these resilience, these environmental aspects of the cities. So these images really, want shock you, and you ask yourself, like, why has man-made disasters sort of become worse over the past few years? Because of lack of oversight. And some of these, I can also share this database that I'm collecting right now, but it's essentially some of the places that I've been collecting to make a point that, these playgrounds or public spaces or streets are in fact critical. So, for example, all across India, stadiums and playgrounds are converted into markets and isolation wards. And you have the Indian Railways recently converted 50% of its coaches to have isolation wards too, because of the constant flow of migrant population from different villages. They sort of isolate them in the railways itself. And these are creative, intelligent ways. But had we sort of imagined these in a prior, future, it could have been done a little more effectively, and maybe we would have more space for those who cannot afford it. And the last part of this conversation, I really want to just quickly do a little plug, which is I'm crowdsourcing this data, which means I wanted to reach as many people in India as possible so that this can become a collective effort and become a report. So this is basically collecting all of the locations in India across different states and looking at what kind of spaces are converted into a critical infrastructure. So most often these are sports arenas, government buildings, they are railway coaches, and then we have public parks that are changed into farmers market, which has never happened before. And we also have transit hubs that also become fruit and vegetable markets. So it's a very interesting data to collect and use spaces that can be shared for other purposes. Past school hours or college hours are now being, in fact, used 24/7. So I think in the future, institutional governance, resilience in terms of water management and its urban commons is going to be very critical. And building that place coalition is something that cities across the world can, strengthen. And I think that's one of the core themes that I keep bringing up in all of my writings as well. So yeah, I'm going to end it there because we can talk about more during our roundtable discussion.
Thank you, Dania, for this double perspective from New York and from Chennai. Very, very interesting. Actually, it's important that actually we compare conditions of the evolution of the pandemic because as we know, it is important in our globalized world that we also understand how we can manage, this pandemic, not just in our own country, but now that everything is moving fast and people and goods are moving fast from different locations, it's always very important to take care about what's happening beyond where we live and beyond our country, so that we have a clear idea on how to, put in place, as you were saying, very effective measures to confine the pandemic until we wait for a real solution, which will not be so fast to find. So now we stay in the United States, but we move to Seattle to Gregory Scroots, who is a journalist, an urban journalist and urban consultant and urban researcher. He writes about many different topics, including public space for specialized and websites and newspapers like Bloomberg, City Lab, Next City, Thomson Reuters Foundation, New York Times, Washington Post, US News, America's Quarterly, and The Guardian. He was also following the process before, during, and after Habitat 3 in Quito, and later WUF 9 and WUF 10. Actually, we met in Kenya at the UN Habitat headquarters, and later in New York at the UN Habitat headquarters. So happy to have you today with us, Greg.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Luisa, for having me. Going back to the presentation. Can you just confirm that the presentation has loaded properly?
Yes, yes,
Good.
we can see
Wonderful.
the presentation and we can hear you.
Great. So I'm going to be talking about a different pandemic today, not the novel coronavirus, but rather the 400 years of institutionalized racism that undergird the entire political and economic system of the United States. And in very short order in the U.S., in June specifically last month, the public health pandemic was to some extent superseded by the much longer duration pandemic, if you will, of racism. And that has led to a reawakening of public space in the United States and US cities in a very radical way, fraught with political tension and pushing for a vision of safety, of safe cities that do not involve armed police officers. And I'll be talking specifically about Seattle, where I live, and a particular protest occupation there that similar models spread to other cities. So this is empty Seattle in April, May, similar to cities around the world under lockdown. And in June, Seattle and many other US cities diverged from the lockdown slow reopening to a very sudden reoccupation of public space, where suddenly, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by police in Minneapolis, people took to the streets in a very pre-pandemic fashion, if you will, of protest, though you'll notice the latex gloves and the masking, and adopting the language around the virus. You know, racism is the deadliest virus, that this issue of systemic racism and police violence justified reoccupying public space, even in defiance of public health orders to limit large gatherings. And of course, those protests ultimately brought police as kind of a flashpoint. And in particular in Seattle, in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, there was a week-long standoff. Those in Hong Kong might recognize the umbrella as a tactical tool. And this week-long standoff of police protester clashes, tear gas, flashbangs, these very violent protests ultimately resulted in this particular neighborhood in Capitol Hill of the police abandoning their police station. And you can see in the upper right corner there, the East Precinct was a particular police station. The Seattle police abandoned the site, and the protesters won, if you will, and began an accidental, unintended occupation of the immediate blocks surrounding this abandoned police station. Just to situate you very quickly, this is the neighborhood Capitol Hill is east of downtown Seattle. It's a mixed-use neighborhood, a number of apartment buildings, residences, bars, restaurants, historically the LGBT neighborhood of Seattle, but also undergoing rapid gentrification in the wake of our technology-fueled economic boom. And then this is a zoom in on specifically the protest occupation, where protesters took over 6 blocks. You'll see the green demarcation adjacent to a large park. And we're actually able to, for several weeks, basically create a micro neighborhood without police. They repurposed barricades to demarcate these 6 blocks where the police were not welcome. And for the better part of June, the protesters sort of created an alternative society in which there was no police presence, at least no armed, uniformed police presence representing the power of the state. Now, as far as this public space reorientation is concerned, one way of accomplishing a police-free neighborhood is, police frequently in the United States travel by vehicle, by automobile, and barricading the streets so that vehicles can no longer travel through the public right-of-way. The kinds of pedestrianization that are very popular in urbanism circles became actually a much more radical tactic in Capitol Hill as a way of keeping out the police. And although one urbanism advocacy group in Seattle specifically saw this as an opportunity to create super blocks, borrowing the formulation from Barcelona that's become quite popular in urbanist circles, there was a sense that this was more radical than creating a super block that offers opportunities for families to walk down the street, but that this was about something much more extreme, if you will, of sort of fundamentally changing the social contract around policing. At the same time, it's undeniable that by putting up these barricades, the protesters created a pedestrianized space par excellence. And I wanted to, speaking of the way that Chuck described some of the very everyday tools that were used to create these refashioned regulations of public space, like the folding table at Kew Gardens, we're seeing the basic infrastructure of traffic management, these orange and white signs and detour and that sort of thing, repurposed to shut down the street to vehicles and open it up to everybody, to pedestrians and everybody who's not police. Once again, police are not welcome in this neighborhood, and their presence would create tension. I also wanted to highlight in the lower right corner this blue sign, which the Stay Healthy Streets are Seattle's initiative to close streets to vehicles to create opportunities during the pandemic for people to walk and cycle without vehicle traffic. And to see that sign repurposed for an unofficial shutdown of the street is kind of a poignant irony that in the first couple months of the pandemic, we were taking these very tepid steps. We might close a few streets here and there so that people can walk and it'll be pleasant. That in the wake of a much deeper seated issue, the issue of racism and police brutality, that clearly superseded in the American imagination the importance of the coronavirus, that we might repurpose the signage for these Stay Healthy Streets and use them for a more radical purpose of creating a police-free neighborhood. I'm rapidly running out of time, so I'm going to move through a few more images. This is the police precinct repurposed. And I want to stress that the emphasis was on occupying the public space outside of the police station. It was not about actually occupying the interior of the building, but the facade was redecorated, if you will, in a way to claim this police station for the people. In the street, there were also opportunities for conversations about systemic racism, that by shutting down the street, there was the opening up of opportunities for dialogue. There were also very powerful memorials to the victims of the George Floyd rebellion, again, occasioned by the opportunity of closing the street to vehicles. Once again, another view of the police precinct. That one's a bit grainy, but this is also an assembly of protesters taking place in the street outside of the police station, as well as this space became an opportunity for organized events to express different views on racial identity amidst the protests. And then finally, the park adjacent became the site of a Black and Indigenous community garden, drawing attention to land loss issues facing the Black community in North America, and concluding with an unsanctioned, unofficial Black Lives Matter street mural that has actually become a permanent feature of the landscape in the wake of the protest occupation, which was dismantled at the end of June. So I'll finish there.
Thank you, Greg, for this presentation. Actually, you are showing us that public space is very rich and full of life in Seattle because of these protests. And we see now in Italy also, not for protests, but people are out in the public space reclaiming what actually was forbidden for like 3 months, because we had a very stressful and long lockdown. We are supposed to take physical distancing and all other health measurements. I see that in the United States this is an issue as well, even for protests. But in the picture that you were showing, many were wearing masks. So I hope that those measures, I mean, they are, people are following those measures even during the protests, because this is very important, because now people are starting to travel again from one country to another, and so we need to take care about this evolution of the pandemic. So, but we will discuss later. Now we move to United Arab Emirates with Yasser Khalil. That is a strategic planner, urban planner and urban designer based at Ajman municipality in the United Arab Emirates. So he has an expertise as a project manager, development manager of development projects, and also for coordination and implementation. So it's nice to have the perspective now of you know, a city manager that could tell us something, I guess, regarding the Arab world and what's going on. Thank you, Yasser. The floor is.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to apologize for being two yeses, but actually the network is not stable, so I joined from my phone. This first. Secondly, I'd like to thank Luisa for inviting me for this webinar, and it's my pleasure to be with this group of experts from different places around the world. Let me begin to save time to share the presentation. Where is it? I'll find it. Let me clarify that it's hard to talk about the Arab world, and as we will go through the presentation, we'll find I recognize that all of you knows how big is it and how there is a lot of variation. But let's talk first about what happened. Okay, the fear and lacking confidence. This is what happened all over the world. Although we have
your presentation is not yet visible. I think we still see
are you sure?
only your folders. Yeah, sorry.
Yes, we see your folder, but we do not see your presentation. Ah, yes, now we see it. Thanks.
That's it?
So
yes, fine.
Okay, the fair is cover the whole world. Although we have since long time some warning from, and I remember that Martin Rees in 2006 announced that there is a lot of trees will face the actually what is the major effect of the pandemic, that lot of human values had been not the people lost the confidence in such human values like the globalization, the freedom, the social life and concept. All these concepts and others become doubt of many people, and instead of this concept, there is other concept appeared: the localization, the quarantine, the isolation, the social distance. Most of the people were afraid from what happened all over the world, and the pictures was full of doctors and health staff and some politicians. Actually, the urban planners did not recognize before, I think, the safety and security. And now they began to look for the future. How could we recognize the safety and security in our planes? This is the situation all over the world and in the Arab world also. The health isolation is staying home and social distance, business closure, no public transportation, working remotely, no public space, no travel restrictions, no life. Let's talk a little bit and give have brief information about the Arab countries. It's not only it's one culture, but with the mixed, diverse, one nation, but various people, different situations, totally different. We have about 22 countries, one language, but many slangs, three religions, but many groups, economic and political difference, a source of oil and source of trouble sometimes, source of migration and refuge, and source of opportunities. It's totally different. And even the United Nations or the UN Habitat make the Arab countries, they separate them for different groups of countries. The Al-Mashriq, they say, and the group of countries in the east and in the west, and the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and the low developed. And we will find from the numbers mentioned in the report of the UN Habitat that the urbanization, the urbanization percentage is totally different. In United Arab Emirates is 86, but in different places in Kuwait it's 100, and in Sudan it's 34, and in Saudi Arabia it's 84. And you will find this is clarify the social and economical and even political difference. Why we need new vision? I think I go through some articles. All of them are mentioning that we need, from the urban point of view, and from not only from the urban planning point of view. Frank Harris by the UNIDO, he mentioned that especially the Arab countries will be shocked economically. And in the short term, and this is the case now either in the Gulf, in Egypt, or wherever. Short term, all firms and industries will need help from the government to be support to survive. And in the long term, they have to build different economies in all countries in general. Another article related to the city visioning, and this is done by Professor Tim Jackson. He's emphasizing that this is opportunity for urban future. We have to rethink in general, not only in the Arab countries, and we will come later to the Arab countries, but we have also 5 keys. I'm trying to go through such why now we are looking for new urbanism or future urbanism. Still by Roger van den Berg, he's discussing the same point. Let me go a little bit through by this is Egyptian professor working in Qatar, and he writes an very nice article and announce maybe at the beginning of the pandemic, and he arise few critical questions about the population density and the collapse of urban retail. This is the most important for me. There is other important questions also about how could the architecture will provide a new vision for the public and the private space, and how the citizen will feel in the city. Lastly, the UN mentioned, and I think most of you will go through this article, but actually at the conclusion they mentioned the highlighted sentence which has impressed me. Envision a realistic way. It means that we are working since long time in not realistic way. And the second one, for building resilience against shocks. So it means that till now we couldn't be able to build. We have to look for those two items. I have another two options which I collect. One of them is emphasizing on the desire of all inhabitants in the blind for the continuation of life. This is good and optimistic, and I like it. It's mentioned in Ali Abdul Rauf by Victor Blue. And the other one is describing the situation in Arab world. It's done by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, because the discussion for a few years ago between the economic and politics, and finally he said that we found that the health is the first, and then we will discuss about the politics and the economy, because the health is the most important now. I think from my point of view, and I am working in a municipality, as Luisa said before, we have to go on ground. We have with appreciation of all theoretical, we have to look for 3 points: more health service, reduction of density, and more public space. And this is, I think, it's common for all Arab countries, whatever the economic situation and whatever the political situation, because both are controlling the life. We find in Saudi Arabia, for example, the Holy Mosque had been closed and still closed till now. And now they are limiting the number of pilgrims that will go in the next week. We need to ensure the health in the life in the Arab life, whatever the country is, and we have to find better healthcare service and open space. And in the level of the municipality, I think we have to begin, and not only the municipalities, the experts all over the world, they have to revise the standard and the regulation to enable the developers to provide health care in small communities, regardless to the standard, to the economics, and ensure health education also in small communities. Because in Egypt, for example, we have shortage in doctors and the health staff in Egypt, and I'm sure in all countries, whatever the country is, because Egypt is about 100 million, and we have a lot of doctors, but most of them are, I'm sorry, I'm finished. This is the last one. We have also to stop the high-rise towers and the high-rise cities, and we have to provide open public space anywhere in the city. Thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Yasser. Very challenging stuff building in a way that many Arab cities have been developed so far. It's a huge challenge, but I understand your point. The need for more public spaces actually is something that I think all countries are discussing right now. So we move to Africa now, to Tanzania, and we have Furha Abwe, who is an urban planner, and he has established this NGO, Urban Planning for Change, if I'm not wrong. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But we are very interested actually to know what you are doing in your local community and how you are addressing the earth emergency. Thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luisa. I need to share. Okay, share. Can you see that?
Yes. You can put your presentation in full screen mode, please. Okay. Yes, fine.
That's okay? Can you see it? Thank you very much.
Yes.
My name is Furaha. I'm Furaha Abwe from Tanzania. I work with Urban Planning for Community Change, which is an NGO that I established after my PhD. And prior to that, I was teaching at the university, but I wanted to put into practice what I learned by helping the community where I'm living with. So I'm trying to, in this presentation, I'll be trying to share my perspective as long as my experience in Tanzania is concerned, where I'm working with the livable cities. I'm working on a livable cities project. Luisa asked me to give a general overview of a pandemic in Africa. And today, when I looked at the WHO website, the update is that in Africa, we have 769,000 cases as per today. And we have 5 most affected countries, which are South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana, and Algeria. But we have also another surprising result, that we have countries which have COVID cases with 0 death. And these are Eritrea, Seychelles, and Uganda. We are also neighboring with Uganda, and this is really true that they don't have any death case reported so far. As other countries or other cities around the world, African cities took similar preventive measures to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. And among them include restricting urban public transport, practicing physical distancing, prohibiting public gathering, ordering curfews, encouraging people to stay at home, and lockdowns, among others. But as we know, these measures were good in terms of limiting the spread, but in one way or the other, they have jeopardized, they've affected negatively people's lives, livelihood, and public health. Unfortunately, in all the measures, public spaces, particularly the green spaces, were not considered as essential services. And in the green spaces, in the public spaces, I will talk about public market and green spaces. Public market in most of the cities, particularly in East Africa, were considered as essential service. But green spaces were not considered. So people were banned to attend or to visit green spaces, but they were allowed to go to the market to buy food items. This is an example in Uganda. These are the measures that the president has announced, where the local food markets were opened, but the green spaces were not allowed to visit. Now, there was a problem when people were confined at homes, in their homes, which most of people are not used to. Now, because of staying at home, people started getting mental health problems, and most of the psychologists have reported this. Now, my organization, Urban Planning for Community Change, in support with some partners, we have been conducting research on public spaces in general in the city of Arusha in East Africa. And we had done 2 separate studies between 2014 and 2019. We did one study on green spaces where we had to identify the quality and quantity of them, of the spaces. And another study was on identifying the quality and quantity of local public markets in the city. And surprisingly, our study revealed that there is a huge spatial inequality of local public market in the city of Arusha. And this forced both vendors and buyers to spend more time on public transport to reach the nearest market. there are a lot of neighborhoods in the city which do not have a single local market. So people have to spend 20 to 30 minutes in the public transport to reach the nearest local market. On the side of green spaces, the city has got enough green spaces, but most of them are not developed. And I think most the town planning department had just assigned them, allocate space for that, but the municipality does not develop them. Most of them are not developed. We have only one which is developed by the city council, and we have other like 4 which are privately owned. On your left side, this is a map showing the green map and green dot showing green spaces in the city of Arusha. Then in a number of them, and on your right, this is a map showing local public markets in the city of Arusha. You can see most of them are like concentrated in the center. So people have to travel from far away to reach the closest market. I've selected a few pictures to show some of the green spaces. The top one, this is the Green Park, Arusha Green Park, which has been developed by the City Council. And then the other ones are also the lower on my left is also developed by the City Council. But the 2 on your right are just open spaces without any infrastructure, without any seating facilities on them. These pictures are showing green space which is privately owned. You can see the type of infrastructure that are there. But for children to get to enter this space, they have to pay at least $2 per day per entry. These are some pictures showing the local public market. And when the coronavirus case was first reported in Arusha, the government put washing facilities, hand washing facilities at every entrance of every local market in the city. And you had to wash your hand before entering the market. Now, based on our study and with the outbreak of the coronavirus, we are thinking that for future planning, we need to do the integration of town planning and public health principles. They have to merge. Historically, we know that town planning emerged or was born after the Industrial Revolution problems which arose centuries ago. Number 2, we are thinking that we need to address spatial inequality by establishing small neighborhood-based public markets so that people can be walking to the market instead of using public transport every time they want to buy their food items. Number 3, we need also to develop green spaces. As I said, our research shows that town planning department has allocated green spaces within the city, but they're just there, they are not developed. So my organization, in collaboration with some partners, we are planning to develop one green space as a model, and we will use this as a tool to advocate to not only to the government, but to other stakeholders so they can be developing green spaces, particularly for the low-income neighborhood. Lastly, my organization will be working hand in hand with the City Council to advocate for allocation of specific budget for public space management. This is what I have to share with you on coronavirus, on the use of public spaces and the post-pandemic future. Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa, for your presentation. It's very important to talk about conditions of public spaces in the post COVID-19 situation. Actually, this is what I would like to discuss now with all the speakers, since when we talk about sustainable urbanization, we are dealing with a certain complexity, and now we are adding another level of complexity, which is safety in regard of health conditions of people living in cities and living in the outdoor open spaces, and how people can actually interact in the future. So we all know that urbanization is one of the most urgent challenges for urban developers and city managers. So the question is, how can we actually address now safety for people while we are already into a very broad complexity while dealing with the sustainable development? Because I think that, we do not really know exactly how to address this new challenge, and we're still, trying to understand how to address the sustainability as a comprehensive concept for cities. Now we also have safety. So how do you think we should change our approach, or how we should reconsider? Because many of you actually, from the manifesto that we had from Chuck and from all of you, I mean, from different expertise and background, the question is actually, how do we, from different positions, because this is not just about urban development or urban planning, it is affecting at many different levels, many different expertise and approaches that must be combined in a, let's say, holistic idea of safety for people living in cities. So how do you think we can? I know that it's a very difficult question, and I'm not expecting that you already have answers for this, but at least we can try to develop this concept more according to your perspective.
Why don't I go and quickly talk about a couple of elements of the manifesto that reflect on what we heard today, if you don't mind, and I'll only take a moment. Greg actually in Seattle touched on an important element, which was sort of a mutual caring, and I didn't have the good fortune to be there, and will entirely defer his reporting on this. But what we saw in many early demonstrations in and around the death of George Floyd was people crossed the lines to help others. That happened in Seattle in terms of cleanups the next day after shops were disrupted. It happened here in London, where in here the focus was on slave trading individuals by way of statues, just like in the United States. People who were hurt from one side would help people from the other side, because there was a feeling of community, even though it was expressing freedom of speech and the right to occupy a public space. So that, I mean, that's where things get very I think fuzzy, if you will. But the fact we're all humans is blatantly obvious, but it's very, very important. I'm just gonna, that's why the top part of the manifesto, I think, is pretty important. Communication, differences and limitations between different classes of society. We can't all be on Zoom calls, right? The front porch idea, which the placemaking movement had some events around earlier in the summer, that showed different people at a distance doing different projects from their front porches or balconies. On mutual understanding and education over and above secondary education or university. Different stories of indigenous populations, and so on and so forth. These other ones are a little more operational, but what I want to stress is that we're accelerating everything we already knew because of this pandemic. And I'm one of those who believes it's a golden opportunity to take a very hard look at some of these issues, amplify some of the tools that we were already using for those who do have technology access, this very forum, or the whole notion of co-creation, in that we, as so many of you pointed out in your presentations, we're not top down anymore in reality, and we have to find a way to be inclusive at a distance. So I recognize those are, you know, that's a loose framework, but I'm certainly on my own trying to answer your question, Luisa. So that's my thought.
Can I just jump in for a moment there?
Yes, sure.
Mutual aid has certainly become a term that's in vogue, at least in North America at the moment. And I think that, as well as solidarity, which are terms that I think are more common in a European lexicon, or places that have a more social, pro-social mindset. Certainly the individualistic culture of the United States is, this idea of solidarity is very foreign to this country's traditions. But it has emerged over the last couple of months. On the one hand, I mean, the pandemic has created a certain rhetoric of solidarity, that we're all in it together, even as the reality has shown that we're not, that some people are forced to go into these essential jobs where they are at higher risk, and others can retreat to their home offices, such as myself. And yet, in the wake of the protests, I think there actually was a more, around racial injustice, a more serious form of solidarity. I mean, nobody that could work from home volunteered to go work in a meatpacking plant, for example. But somebody who maybe was comfortable in their privilege as a white person in the United States did show up in the streets for racial justice. And I think in a funny way, the rhetoric of solidarity around the pandemic, which was kind of a fiction, became actually much more real in the context of the occupation of public space around racial injustice.
And don't you, I just want to add, don't we see that now, Greg, down in Portland with the wall of moms showing up to take on the federal troops?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make this too US-centric of a conversation, but certainly
right.
some quite serious, I mean, conflicts between the state and the citizenry taking place right now that, yeah, I would agree, but I'll table it there unless people want to hear more about the US dirty laundry.
Yeah, I would like to add on to that, because we're talking about right to the city and dissent, and how it's interesting because different countries have dealt with dissent in a very different way during the pandemic. And in India, especially since the anti-CAA protests, which have still been going on for 101 days now. And it's like the longest protest in modern India. And people have still been trying to go to the capital city's Shaheen Bagh, which has become a name for, protest itself, and how it's created this sort of a Friends of Shaheen Bagh, sort of a collective, informal collective that co-opted, that started because of this, protests. And it showed solidarity amongst different religions, different castes, and it was led by women. And when we are speaking about safety of women and their presence in public space, and this protest was, it showed a different picture of women who are of different age groups who can collectively occupy a space for 101 days during the bitter cold of Delhi. And there has been pushback from the government to paint them, in different pictures. But moreover, what it showed was you could create, a sporadic self-governing entity, which is, which could be a collective movement. And the thought of urban commons and the right to the city definitely spreads to this aspect of how our city is being reimagined as, like a new age collective. And that is not state-centric, that is decentralized, and which is not top-down all the time. So I think it's really interesting seeing the Black Lives Movement in the other parts of the world and protests against Muslim minorities in India, which is so diverse in its way in which state police have dealt with it. But the bottom line was police injustice and violence is the bottom line, the key theme there. So surveillance also played a role in the way public spaces are being extra surveillance during the pandemic. And yeah, I would be happy to talk more about that as we progress.
Anyone else? Ah, yes, sir. We cannot hear you. You should unmute yourself.
Sorry. I'm glad to hear from my colleagues around the world, and I think maybe the next step, or we have to discuss in the future how the open space could be promote for the human values. Okay, whatever the human, regardless to the religion, to the color, to the whatever, regardless of, and because after the pandemic, we found a lot of restriction in connecting people, and every family stay at home, no interaction. So how could we make it safe? And we cannot forget the values that had been built during the few decades or the last centuries, the freedom. Okay, how could we control the people without putting them in, making their houses like prisons? How could we let whatever the pandemic is, it will be end now, or it will be come again, or any other pandemic? How could we make the people feel safe and secure in their houses, in their open spaces? How could we make small, quick wins to increase the area of open spaces? And it should be open for all people, regardless to the classification, or regardless to anything. Thank you.
That's a that's an interesting question. That actually it is addressing freedom to be, freedom to express, freedom to live safe in public space, which is something that it is embedded in the concept of public space, but it is also dealing with the control, because now everyone is somehow controlled. In many countries, you are supposed to download an app on your smartphone to control your health conditions and in the way you interact with other people. This app was also promoted in Italy, but it ended up in a failure because not so many people are downloading the app, because there are many concerns about who is taking my data regarding myself and my health conditions, who is managing and protecting my data. And many people do not really want to share data. And this app only works when many are downloading and using the app, because otherwise it is not effective enough. So this is also an issue, because Yasser said freedom, and a lot of discussions also were developed during the lockdown in Italy regarding the fact that the government was asking us to stay at home for a very long period, thus limiting our freedom to go out and to live our life. To be independent in the way you move in the city. So there were so many limitations. So it's not just about safety, it's also about control. The government is trying to control for our safety, but somehow, while helping us to stay safe, while helping us to save lives, they are, the government and the authorities are actually creating a problem for social life. So there is a balance that we need to manage while talking about how do we want to be safe, and if we want to follow rules and restrictions, do we want to trust the government? And this is an individual decision. It's not something that depends from other condition. It's all about us and what we think is the right decision, the right condition for us to live safe while keeping our lifestyles. And for example, in Italy, one of the discussions is about women, because women are supposed to, take care about the family and children, and they cannot, deal with their work and the family and the children. Now that there are also so many limitations for children. They cannot go to school, they have to stay at home, someone must stay at home to take care about the children. So there are a lot of counter effects that are actually superimposing to the society as a whole and to some groups. I mentioned women and children, but also older persons, which are, very important in the management of a family, especially for children. In Italy, grandparents are taking care about children. And now we have to separate the children from grandparents because most of older persons were affected by the virus. And so they were somehow isolated from families because of the fear of the contagion. So it's a problem that is related to the society mostly. And so how do we plan a new society according to all these counter effects, all these, very problematic situations that are I'm now addressing Italy, but you cannot hear me? Can you hear me now?
Problem with your voice, maybe you mute it.
Can you hear me now?
There's a background noise from somewhere.
Can you hear me now?
Here, yes, it's just sounding.
Okay. So I was asking, how do we plan a new society? It's not just about cities, it's about how do we plan a new society? How do we create this confidence, as Yasser was also mentioning, between people? How can I be confident to be in touch with all of you in the real outdoor space? How do I know that I'm safe if I have to meet you in the public domain? This is the question. Now that everyone is starting to travel again, we are having a lot of cases in Italy from people traveling to Italy from other countries. And now they are supposed to, go back to their country because we had a lot of new COVID-19 cases from these people traveling to Italy. So the borders are now again closed to some countries. So borders are closed. So how do we experience the world that we knew? I mean, globalization, freedom of movements, and the endless possibilities for everyone to live in a globalized world. That's big question. Is there anyone that wants to make a comment on this?
I can probably give a quick jump in quickly. So I think there are two things, right? People are able to more now than ever, like connect across different continents sitting at their house, but at the same time, they're not able to go to different places. So it's like this two different things that are happening at the same time. But I guess that solidarity that Gregory mentioned, or the aspect of building this social cohesion, it's the fact that we're able to stick together as a community, right? And building this aspect of community doesn't happen, normally. It happens when you face the most adverse situations, and I think that's become a big it shows that people are able to cut across their, not heavily dependent on just government subsidies or government aid, but social institutions. Your local community garden is now a farmer's market, where in neighborhoods where you only have big box markets with nearly no fresh food for the locals, this is the access to fresh food. And the aspect of market spaces, which Fura mentioned in his presentation, it's also been shown in many studies that a more dense city, such as in India, for example, I'm not sure about how it works in other parts, but Shima Hamidi had written a research article about how density is not really a bad thing, and that when you have high dense populations, you have better infrastructure that is developed, and you have a more socially cohesive urban area, and you also have better access to fresh fruit and vegetable markets, and you don't have to drive all the way to the nearest, Whole Foods or whatever. So I think that when you talk about how can we build a livable future, can we also address, like, I hope that cities suddenly don't realize, okay, extreme urban sprawl is the way to go now, because in Dharavi, which is considered the largest slum, 1 million residents live there, and people were so afraid that something is going to go really bad if one person gets coronavirus. But it has been so successful in containing it. There have been 75 deaths, and in a place that is so dense, they were able to tackle coronavirus and flatten the curve by containing it. And that happened because there is this mutual sense of community in this very dense urban neighborhood. And that's an interesting thing that keeps coming up while talking about COVID. Is density bad or good? But yeah, and I think, I don't know if Yasser, you want to talk about it more, or Fura, because I'm really interested in knowing how social infrastructure can be, positively built, or critical infrastructure can be positively built in denser cities. So yeah, that's one of the things that I wanted to throw out on the discussion as well.
Any comments? Yes, if you do not want to add additional comments, maybe we ask Ying Fen if there are some questions from the audience.
Yes, here is a question. This question asking about how much do you feel that the pandemic discourses has disrupted or advanced our conversation about sustainability and ecologically progressive change in public space? Do you think one or the other takes priority where the discussion do not overlap?
Yes, which is exactly what we were discussing.
Yeah, so
before.
I think
yes.
probably we already.
Do you want to say anything to answer to this comment?
I'll just chime in that I found that, I didn't hear the last part of the question. I'm sure I could look at it here, but I think one or the other takes priority where the discussions do not overlap. I've been concentrating on the overlaps because, of course, many of the post-COVID transportation solutions are also speak to the issues of climate change. However, ironically, we have this situation where public transport is not as safe as it once was, and so the people who can't bicycle or walk are using their cars more. So it's a dilemma, and I think this is with everyone else, you saw my examples of small changes that can take place, or to access the fruit market, maybe it comes to you, and some of the other examples I had. But there has to be some central government planning about something, and so I think what we're seeing here in the United Kingdom is there is new discussion about climate change because people are realizing, people are monitoring data more carefully, and they're realizing the down trend of pollution that took place during the lockdown, but now that people are coming back, they're seeing it come back and trying to figure out what to do about it. So there, you know, all I can say is that through some combination of neighborhood group and government co-created discussions, there needs to be attention to where these two things conflict. Is it going to be government and environment agencies talking more with public health people? Maybe, but I don't think we have the answers yet in terms of the structural solutions to this. I don't think it's fair to ask. I think it's fair to ask which should control.
I mean, I would just add too that the reductions in air, there's an unspoken truth that the improvements in air quality and reductions in pollution came at an enormous economic cost. I mean, those who promote a sort of a just transition to a more climate-friendly future often try to argue that there are not trade-offs. Like improving, ecological improvements do not necessarily mean economic losses. But at least under the pandemic, that's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying that necessarily invalidates reasons to reduce air pollution and the like, but we can't ignore that it was precisely a reduction in economic activity that led to an improvement in ecological outcomes. And how you do both in the future, I mean, I don't think you can personally, and we need to come up with other metrics of society that aren't just GDP measurements and the like, but obviously there was a lot of tremendous material suffering for humanity. Poverty numbers are supposed to skyrocket over this year because of the pandemic. That, there are trade-offs, and sometimes they're quite brutal.
Okay, so time is almost over. So in case Furha, you want to add anything else, or Yasser, otherwise we move to the conclusion of this webinar.
One comment.
Okay, yes, sir, go on.
Okay.
Yes.
Just a small
yes.
I'd like what mentioned by Gregory at the end, that we cannot make either the climate improvement and the economic situation, because there is a lot of people are working and they need to work, but we have to ask the government to provide for them suitable condition, which is, and to keep the life sustainable. Maybe in Egypt you have this condition. A lot of people, after the close up, a lot of people stay at home, but they cannot eat. We have to give them we have to balance between the economic situation and the need to live in sustainable life. So I agree with this point. It's very critical. Thank you.
Yes, I don't have any addition on that.
Okay then. So thank you everyone for joining. I mean, the speakers for this interesting discussion that can be actually extended in a future maybe a webinar when as soon as we have more information regarding the evolution of the contagion and of the pandemic. I think this will be an ongoing discussion for quite a long time. So now I pass the floor to my colleague Hendrik to close this webinar.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much for attendees and also the great panel. And I think it's interesting to see now we are in the third month of webinars, right? And we can see how themes are evolving, like in addition to the health issues, that there are a lot of questions about societal response and the protest movements and so on, overlaying to the question of the health issues, right? On the other hand, to come back to those kind of issues that we were also discussing before the pandemic, right? Climate change and so on, when they come back into the discussion and this kind of link to it. And of course, the big question that will probably stay off for many years after the crisis is the economic injustice and the economic problems that the pandemic also has created. Right? So thanks very much for the great contributions. And we will basically announce our next sessions via social media and our website. We are still in the planning for the next event, because we have this month actually 5 sessions, and we will still communicate with you what we will do next week. But for August, there's already a long lineup with additional themes. So as the crisis evolves, also more people also are contacting us and want to be part of the discussion. So if there's anyone else who wants to join for themes and discussion, please contact us. And soon we will also post the video of this session on our YouTube channel. And that's it from my side. And thanks again. And we see you next Thursday. Okay. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.